Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming out on a cold and, well, I should say a warm and blistering, beautifully sunny 7 p.m. meeting in February. It's a little chilly tonight and a lot of cold rain, but it's warm in here, and thanks for being here. Just want to open up a word of prayer, and then I'm going to introduce Rex, and we will take it from there. So would you pray with me, please? Father, we just we're thankful tonight for a time to come together as a school. We thank you that you have plans for Arborbrook, and Lord, we have been seeking those plans for some time. Tonight, Lord, is a night to talk about some of the details of those plans and to get some feedback. So we just ask, Father, that you would give words to speak, that there would be clear communication, and also, Father, there would be unity of thought and mind as we pursue your perfect will for our school. We just ask for your continued wisdom and guidance. We need you. This is your school, and we trust you in this process. Just ask that you would use each one of us tonight to be part of that process too. We trust you, and we thank you for this evening in Jesus' name. Amen. So allow me to introduce Mr. Rex Noble. Rex is one of those parents that has actually been in our school since the very beginning of Arborbrook, and he leads our board, and he's got lots of stories I'm sure he can tell. But I'm going to duck out of the way, and you can actually introduce Bryan and take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Well, thank you all for being here, as Andy said, on such a beautiful night, and appreciate your time. And the way we're going to try to do this is to go through, I'm going to, most of the questions, I think, as a whole are probably what's a ground lease. And for those of you who don't know what a ground lease is, we're going to try to go through and explain that. And I'm going to do sort of a question answer. I'll give Bryan some questions, and he'll give the answers. And then when we're through with that question and answer period, hopefully you'll have a better understanding. And if there's any questions after that, then we'll open up the floor, and you're welcome to ask them. And I may interject a few things as we go along around certain parts of what we're going to try to do here over the next few months that will last for many years to come. But I'm going to introduce Bryan Durrett. So Bryan's a friend of mine. We have worked together for the last 18 plus years. Bryan has been outside counsel for our firm when I was with the previous firm I was with. And we've done, I think, we decided somewhere over 5,000 leases and ground leases over the last 18 years. So, and my comment to Bryan as we went through things was, if something was wrong, fix it. So Bryan was my fixer. So and have great confidence and trust in him. But just to give you a little background of Bryan, so Bryan is a real estate attorney. He's a graduate of Phillips Academy out of Andover, Massachusetts. So Phillips is one of the premier schools. He would say the premier school, but it's one of the premier private schools in the country. We were talking, and I asked him if we could have 1% of their endowment. So a little different from us. His endowment, the school's been around since 1778. Their endowment is $1.2 billion. And I said, just 1%.
That's a high school.
That's a high school. So, but there's also folks that went to Phillips Academy with the last name of Bush and Kennedy and others. So John was 2 classes above you at Andover. Behind you. Oh.
I like to say he started 1 year behind me and finished 2 years behind me. He was not a smart man, as Forrest Gump would say.
So now on his undergraduate degree was actually from Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. Yeah. Some would refer to it as Duke. I think of it as Trinity. They have a basketball team as well, for those of you who don't know. He went on to get his Juris Doctorate at law at Pitt, and then followed by a Master's of Law at Miami. And I learned this as well. Actually, when you're going through law school, the doctorate comes first, and then the master's, which is backwards. I guess that's why they practice law, right? Yeah. So, but anyway, just a little bit. He's got a lot of experience with ground leases, tenant leases, and all kinds of stuff like that. As I said, just for us, he's done over 5,000, so has a lot of experience. And when I first thought of doing this, when the board got together and we first thought of doing this, he was obviously my first choice to do it. One, because of just in anything, trust is really important. And then from that, just working together with him for so long. And just to add a little bit of flavor to the trust, I think trust is not only important with who we're dealing with, but trust through the body. And I think anybody who's heard me say much about it, trust of the church, who is also part of the body here. And so in my mind, if one part of the body loses, the entire body loses. And so what my conversation with Bryan before we went to have conversations with the church was that I want you to be open and say where things are either positive or negative for each party. And that's such a different way to approach things. But I think that if we went in saying we've got to win and they've got to lose, then the body loses. And so that was the thought process going in. And we were just talking a little while ago, and he was thinking of something that we were talking about, and I said, well, we need to bring that up because that's something that we need to add to the ground lease. And so that's kind of the approach that we took. And so now we're going to dive in a little bit to what is a ground lease and why it's important. So what is a ground lease, Bryan?
You're asking me that question?
Yes.
As if I'm supposed to know. No, actually, ground leases are pretty complex, and of all the types of leases, whether it's a tenant lease or a ground lease or an air rights lease, ground leases are probably one of the most comprehensive and complex relationships between a landlord and a tenant. A ground lease is a lease between one company, one entity, in this case the church, that owns the land and does not want to sell the land but wants to retain ownership, but the tenant wants to occupy the land and use it for its purpose. The ground lease situation is typically that a tenant constructs improvements on the land, which in this case would be the school building, so you want it to be a long-term situation. The tenant doesn't want to enter into a short-term lease, spend all this money on improvements, and then have the lease expire, and then no longer own the building or the right to use it. So a ground lease is a long-term lease between the ground owner and the ground occupant, whereby the occupant, the tenant, and the landlord owner have agreed for what purpose the land will be used. And in this case, we have the construction of a school building and the long-term use of the school building on the land, and the landowner continues to own the land. The tenant never owns the land, but they have the right to use the land for the agreed-upon period of time.
Thank you. Did you know it was so complex? So how much land constitutes the leased property?
It can be whatever's agreed upon. I've had circumstances where the tenant leases many, many acres, and we've had ground leases where the tenant leases a small footprint around the perimeter of the building. In this case, the school will lease a 5,000 square foot, roughly, footprint of the land, and then a perimeter 5 feet out from the footprint of the building, so that the tenant does not have the right vis-a-vis the ground lease to use the rest of the land. We'll have another agreement here that we'll talk about momentarily as to what happens to access to the new building, parking, use of utilities, etc. But in this case, the leased premises is just going to be the building footprint and then a few feet out from the footprint. So there'll be some landscaping that will be the responsibility of the tenant, but everything else will be the responsibility of the church.
And then to add a little bit to that, what we've contemplated is building this first building, but we will have built into the ground lease the ability to expand to a second building, because the hopes are that 5 or 7 years down the road after the first building's built, that'll house the high school and the junior high, that we'll be able to come back and build a second sister building that's basically next door to it that would house the lower school, and then all the school would be combined in 2 buildings, and then the rest of the space would be flexible space for use otherwise. But so that's did I get that right, Julie? Okay. So what uses can be made of the leased premises?
In this case, specifically, it's a school building with classrooms. There can be other permitted uses. We, of course, build into the original ground lease what the purpose will be, and is to construct and use a school building, but we also include any ancillary uses there too. So if you have some storage rooms, or you have a cafeteria, those kinds of things, all are available as ancillary uses to the primary use, but it could be whatever the landlord and tenant agree upon. For example, if 15 years from now you decide it's no longer viable to have a school here, do you have another permitted use? And that's something you will have to discuss with the church and see, can you do something else if the school no longer becomes viable, or you outgrow the space and you need to move somewhere else. But for now, the initial use is school with classrooms.
And so you mentioned a few minutes ago we lease the 5,000 square foot. So the first building is proposed to be 10,000 square feet, 2 levels, which would have an elevator, because if you have a school in this county, you need at least 10 acres. And if you go up to a second floor, you have to have an elevator. That's just a requirement. So, and then the 5-foot perimeter around the building. But you also mentioned about what happens with the other land in the area. And can you talk a little bit about how they would share those areas, like parking areas and utilities and septic and insurance and other common elements?
Most of that, and this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of the ground lease, most of that is going to be covered in a separate common area maintenance agreement, for lack of a better term. We'll identify the name of the document, but it will address the use of anything outside of the footprint of the building. If the school needs to use the parking areas, they'll need to use the access driveways, they'll need to be able to tie into utilities, use the existing septic system, and somebody has to maintain all of those things and ensure against liability occurring on any of the common areas. So this agreement will address the shared use of all of the common facilities and the cost thereof. For example, if the school uses 25% of the common facility, and I don't mean by area, I mean their use is 25% of the use of the common areas, and the church estimated to be 75% use just because they have more people coming and going, then you may just agree that 25% of all of the costs will be allocated to the school and 75% allocated to the church. And that would mean normal maintenance, that would mean repairs, replacement. If at some point the parking lot needs to be replaced, somebody has to account for that and pay for it. And this shared maintenance agreement will be the document that we look to determine who pays what. It may be different for different aspects of the common areas. For example, if the school uses bathrooms more than the church does, and therefore the septic system is used more heavily by the school, then maybe you'll say, all right, septic system, we need to do 50-50, but everything else will be 25%. That's still up for discussion at this point, and I'm sure Rex will be heavily involved in those discussions with the church, but that will be a separate document, and we'll address it there. And of course, not just utilities, but also insurance. So if something happens on a common area where there's liability, then we need to figure out how that gets addressed as well.
Yeah, and a couple of things. We probably have those, don't lock in on those percentages, because those are probably switched. It's probably 75-25 the other way. So don't want anyone to think, oh, we're in for 25% because we clearly use more. But one of the other things Bryan mentioned was a common area maintenance agreement. And any of you that are involved in commercial property, you'll be used to hearing CAM charges or whatever. And Jeff Harper, I see you out there. I know you're familiar with CAM charges, but that's just, yeah, okay, yes, thanks.
I
But,
prefer
that's-
Cameron Diaz.
There you go. But that's just common in commercial uses and sharing of expenses. But so that's one place that we'll address and go through the that to work out something that works for both parties. So go ahead.
Something that we should throw in at this point that Rex and I just spoke about a little while ago that's not currently in the ground lease is there may be improvements other than the building that the school agrees to do. For example, I think you mentioned there's going to have to be another parking lot constructed. And from what I understand, the school is going to be responsible for all improvements required resulting from this new building.
Yes, that's correct. And that our thought is that that building would go. The building would go basically where the quad is. It'll be a little bigger, obviously, and then the additional parking would probably go the other side of the church office. So that's the initial thoughts. Now all of that has to be approved, but not by the church, but by the town more than likely. The church is on board with all of this. So with that, does the landlord have any say in the school building and what it will look like?
In most cases, the landlord has approval rights because it's going to be on the landlord's land in amongst the other buildings owned by the landlord. So in this case, the church and the school have agreed that the church will participate in the design and configuration of the building, so they'll be intimately involved with what the school building looks like. Inside, perhaps not so much because nobody's looking at the inside. From the outside, they probably don't care a whole lot what the design on the inside looks like, but they do care very much what it looks like from the outside, so they'll be involved in the design process.
They will, but that's not anything that I frankly am concerned about in the least. I think as we look at this campus and we think of a new building, and my lovely wife said, I hope it looks sort of Charlotte Mason-y. And so I think that would be something that most of us would like, and I think the church could easily get behind that. So that would be my hope as well, is that it has a warm feel as you approach it, and again be very Charlotte Mason-like. So I get points for that? Well, I don't get points for
I
that.
thought you told me it was going to be a Tudor-style building.
There you go. Could be. Okay. Are alterations or improvements permitted?
Similar to the design of the exterior, the landlord is going to want to have some say if you make alterations in the future, what those alterations look like. Again, not so much on the inside, but certainly on the outside. You'll be limited by the perimeter of the ground leased area, so you can't expand because there's only 5 feet to work with. But if you're going to change the facade or you're going to put on a new roof of a different style, then the landlord would have some say in that decision-making process.
Yeah, but as you all are aware, we've made improvements throughout the years, whether it be pavers going from one place to the other, and that really, I don't see that changing, whether it be setting up additional picnic areas or what have you. So I think this, at least in my mind, and I think the church's mind, is this just cements a more long-term relationship, and so it should only improve our relationship overall. But we will have documents that will help lay that out, because I don't think in 20 or 25 years most of us will still be here unless we're here as grandparents of children that are coming. So, I hear chattering. Okay, is the lease conditioned on government approvals?
Yes, absolutely. If the school is unable to build the building that it needs, there's no reason for the ground lease to be in effect. So if the school makes application to the city or the county for approvals and doesn't get those approvals, then the ground lease is meaningless. Now, the way it will be, ground lease is drafted is the tenant needs to apply for those approvals and diligently pursue the approval process so that it doesn't get delayed, keeping in mind that the rent, and we'll get to this question shortly, but the rent doesn't start until the building's complete. So the landlord wants to start collecting rent if they've given up possession of part of their land sooner than later, so that we want, well, the school is going to have to diligently pursue the application process, and we have an outside date set for what happens if the approvals aren't obtained by that date. And then you either work to extend that period, or you say, we're crying uncle, we're never going to get it, so you terminate the ground lease.
You're going ahead of me. That's part of my question. So who owns the building?
The building initially is owned by the school. All of the improvements constructed on the leased premises, I'm not talking about this parking lot or any other off-site improvements, but the building itself on the leased premises is owned by the school until the end of the ground lease.
So what's the term of the ground lease?
We've set up the initial term of the ground lease at 40 years. These long-term, as I mentioned at the start, ground leases are long-term because you don't want to put a lot of money into a building and then have the lease expire quickly before you have sufficient use of the building. So we set it up with an initial term of 40 years, which is actually on the short end for ground leases. We've seen them 60 and 70 years. But the school as a tenant has 3 renewal options, each for a period of 10 years. So the ground lease could go out as long as 70 years at the option of the school.
Exactly. So, and that's not unusual. That will also help. Banks don't like to finance either without that long-term security in the ground lease, and so that'll be an important part for financing. So, okay, how is rent determined?
In any number of ways, but the most logical way and customary way to determine the initial rent at the beginning of the ground lease term is a return on investment for the landlord. What you do is value the land that's being leased and the use of the common areas, and then figure out a customary return on that value. And I put as a silly example in the answers to these questions, for example, if the ground is worth $100,000, and it may be worth more, it may be worth less, but then you figure out if the current investment value of that land is 5% per year, then you take 100,000, multiply it by 5%, you have $5,000 per year for initial rent.
That's, yeah, and I don't know how close that is, but we'll figure that out. But just a little side note. So one of the things we would do is figure out a land value and and get to that through probably an appraisal of the actual land that we're using, then determine that. But just to kind of put this in perspective from a monetary standpoint, we've looked, and so to do any school in Union County, you have to have at least 10 acres of land. Okay, that's the minimum. And so probably several of you drove by the land as you're going into Wesley Chapel there on the right. We actually looked at that land, and it was about $1 million, just under $1 million for 11 acres. But we also figured that that's just the land start. So by the time you do the improvements, before you start any building, we're in for almost $4 million. Okay, and that's before we start the building. Here, even if the land value is 3 or 4 times what Bryan mentioned, you're in for, $10,000 to $20,000, not $4 million before you start building. And so you kind of end up in the same place, and you end up with that, with those improvements for up to 70 years.
And your infrastructure is already in as well.
Yeah, and the infrastructure is already in, so some of those expenses are not going to be incurred. So this is the main reason why we're going the way we're going, is our pockets aren't deep enough to go buy land and build on it. They're just not. unless Bryan's endowment at Andover is going to give us 1%. I told him I just want 1%. That's $12 million. What's so big about $12 million if you got 1.2?
I have zero say in whether any of that endowment can be used here.
There you go.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So when do we were talking about the rent? When do the rent payments begin? And you already answered a little bit of this.
Well, right. I didn't give a complete answer to that, but typically rent begins when the building is complete and ready for use. In this case, we would consider that to be certificate of occupancy, either a preliminary or a final certificate of occupancy, so that you can at least get in and operating, and that's the date that rent starts. However, your landlord, the church, is going to want to have a drop-dead date for that rent to begin, so that if the school is slow in constructing the building, and everybody was expecting the rent commencement date to be, let's say, January 1 of 2020, and January 1 of 2020 comes and goes, and the building's only half built, the church is sitting there saying, we were expecting that money, we'd already spent it, so you put an outside date on it and say it will be the earlier of substantial completion of the building as evidenced by a certificate of occupancy, or January 1 of 2020. And I'm not saying that's the day you'll agree to. I'm just giving you an example so that there's a finite outside date by which the rent will begin.
Okay. And I love my brothers at the church, but we do tend to move a little faster than they do. So I'm not as concerned about that piece. So
well, it's your permits
yeah.
that are going to be your holdup, and it's going to be weather. It's going to be signing the ground lease.
And it could be loan, permits, loan. Many things could take a little longer than you anticipate. So does the rent adjust during the term, typically in a ground lease?
Virtually always. Only when the rent is $1 per year. And there are circumstances where it's $1 per year, but in this case it's not. So yes, there needs to be some adjustment of rent, and rent can adjust annually. It can adjust periodically, say every 3 years or 5 years. It could be every 10 years. It can go up fixed increases. It can go up by the consumer price index, although fixed increases and consumer price index rarely track inflation for ground lease rents exactly. So what we typically do is at some period of time, let's say every 10 years, you reset the rent to fair market value, because it could get out of whack either in favor of the landlord or the tenant, and it benefits one party and not the other. So you say, all right, every 10 years, we're going to have it reappraised, and we'll reset at the beginning of year 11 at the new fair market rent, and then we'll continue to increase the way it had been in the past, either some percentage per year or by CPI.
Okay, I can't let you just say $1 a year in ground rent and not address that. So I have to, because you guys have to be saying, well, why don't we do $1 a year in ground rent? Well, the reason, most of the ground leases that I've done with Bryan have been $1 a year in ground rent, but there's a reason for that. Most of them have been on a hospital campus, and we're doing it for physicians, and the reason that it's $1 a year is you do a reversionary calculation at the end that shows that the hospital and the physicians haven't received any undue benefit, but it's a way to hold rent down so the physicians that are third party pay less rent. And it's a benefit to the hospital because then they're admitting to the hospital. So that's the $1 a year. So don't get that in your head that we're doing $1 a year. Fair? Is that fair?
Fair enough.
Okay. Okay. Will the school obtain a loan for construction of the building? So that's I'm going to take that one. So yes, we will, unless somebody out there is willing to write a check for $1.5 million or so. Yes, we will need to get a loan, and so we are going to obviously start a fundraising campaign. That's coming. It's all part of the process, and to the extent that we are able to raise funds, we'll borrow less. But we're going to borrow enough to get it done, and so the thought is that we're hopefully in that 50% 50 or 60% leveraged or less. That would be the hope, but we will have to see where the funds come in and go from there. But to the extent that we can raise more money, then we will have less leverage or debt. And then will the land be encumbered by a deed of trust? This is really important.
One of the most, probably the second most complex area of the ground lease is financing. And as you know, in most real estate loan transactions, there's a promissory note and a deed of trust. The promissory note evidences the debt. It means you borrowed the money and you agreed to pay the lender back on a scheduled basis. And the loan, the promissory note, is secured by a deed of trust that encumbers the property, so that if you don't pay the debt, the lender can foreclose. In this case, there will also be a construction loan agreement, because I presume you're borrowing the money to construct the building. There will be advances made by the lender as the construction progresses. So there will be at least those three documents. Now, what does the lender have as collateral if the school does not own the land? You'd figure who would want to make a loan on a building and not the land? Well, there are banks that do. What they take as collateral is the school's interest in the ground lease, which gives the school the right to occupy the land for anywhere from 40 to 70 years, the initial term plus the renewal periods, so that if the bank has to foreclose, they have the right to own the building and have the school's interest in the ground lease, the right to remain there so they don't have to move the building. They have the right to remain there and continue to use the building for its intended purposes. They have to honor the ground lease, so they can't tear it down and build a bank on it, but at least they have the collateral and may be able to find another school or somebody to occupy the building and won't get stuck with it or having to demolish it or move it. So the answer is, will there be a deed of trust on the land? No. The church's interest in the land remains unencumbered by any loan, any deed of trust. It's only encumbered by the lease, so that the bank, as I said, would be able to honor the lease, step in as the new tenant, but they can't take title to the land. This is what's called an unsubordinated ground lease. The landlord does not have to put up the land as collateral.
Okay, so, and we talked about this with the church, and this isn't on our list here, but would there be a memorandum of lease, and if so, why?
Okay. Well, the memorandum of lease is it's not a requirement, but it is a legal theory that says you have an interest in this land. It's something that gets recorded in the Register of Deeds so that everybody on the planet knows that you have the right to use and occupy this piece of land. It's just a two-page summary of the lease terms, and by the terms, it doesn't speak to any economic terms. It just speaks to who the parties are, how long the original term is, that there are 3 renewal options, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, a right of first offer for the benefit of the tenant. And those are the only items that have to be put in this memorandum of ground lease, but it shows that the school has a lease on this piece of property, and it sets the legal priority of this ground lease. And that's important in 2 ways. If the church ever finances its land and then defaults, and its lender forecloses on the church land, they have to honor your ground lease, because they know about the ground lease, and actually the ground lease has priority over the church's deed of trust, unless the school signs a subordination, but that gets pretty complicated, and you're likely to sign a subordination as long as the bank agrees not to wipe out the ground lease if they ever foreclose on the church's land. The other more important piece in this case...
That was pretty important.
It is. That's actually... It's not rare, but it doesn't happen all that frequently. In the downturn, it happened a fair amount. I can tell you some stories about times when we were really glad we had recorded a memorandum of the lease. But in this case, because the church is unlikely to finance its land, most nonprofits don't.
And they currently have no debt.
So you will be in first priority position for your land, for the land that you lease. And there won't be anything that can wipe you out because the church doesn't pay taxes, the school, I'm guessing, doesn't pay taxes. So there won't be any property tax sales that would wipe it out. But you have the right to pay taxes anyway under the ground lease if the church doesn't pay taxes if it ever gets assessed. There are reasons that could happen. The church might sell to a for-profit company 20 years from now. Let's say a developer comes along and says, I'd love to have this land, church, will you sell it to us? You don't exercise the right of first offer. You allow it to be sold to a developer. They come and finance it. Things can happen. But more importantly, the memorandum of ground lease says to any buyer of the property that you have a ground lease. So under North Carolina law, if you have not recorded a memorandum of ground lease and the church sells to a developer can come in and say, get out, because you don't have it. My deed, which is recorded in your ground lease with no memorandum recorded, because I recorded my deed before you ever recorded a memorandum, it has priority. So I own the land free and clear of your ground lease, get out. So we want a memorandum of ground lease on record so nothing like that happens. Anybody acquiring the land would have to deal with you knowing that you have a long-term ground lease in place.
That's why we want good counsel, and important to be protected on the front end, someone who does this all the time and not going to someone who doesn't do it all the time. Those are some of the important facts. So if someone gets injured on the leased premises, who's responsible?
On the leased premises is your responsibility as the school. Remember, you have taken complete control, possession of the leased premises. That's the footprint of the building, it's inside the building, and it's that 5-foot area around the perimeter of the building over which you have complete control and are required to carry liability insurance and will have responsibility if somebody gets injured there. So the recommendation is you carry sufficient insurance to address any potential liability. Now, if somebody gets injured, is that
On the
next
camp,
question?
yeah, on the camp.
The rest of the campus, then the common area maintenance agreement that we talked about will address liability for anything that happens in the shared areas. And there will be a shared cost. Everything in the shared areas we're setting up as the responsibility of the church to take care of it, to maintain it, to repair it, replace it, to insure it, but you share in the cost. So if somebody gets injured, we're requiring under that common area maintenance agreement that the church carry liability insurance, but you will pay a pro rata share of that liability insurance so that it's covered, but you look to the policy obtained by the church. If something happens in a church building, then they're responsible for it.
Okay, and what happens if the building itself suffers casualty?
The point of a long-term ground lease is that the tenant has to use and occupy the building and the premises for 40 to 70 years. So if the place burns down in year 5, then both parties want the building to be reconstructed. Now, you may go and negotiate with them and say, look, the school wasn't going well. It's not viable any longer. We'd like to do something else or just terminate. And you can have that discussion, but the tenant is obligated to reconstruct the building. That's why you carry casualty insurance for the improvements.
Very good.
Now, at the end of the lease term, let's say you're in year 68, you may say, look, it doesn't make sense to rebuild a building with only 2 years left on the lease, so why would we do that? Let's just raise the debris, give it, and terminate the ground lease, give the land back to the church. Now, the question is who's entitled to the insurance proceeds. We'll talk about reversionary rights in just a minute, but the church was expecting in 2 more years to own the building, free and clear. So there was an asset sitting there. So they have a good argument that they're entitled to most of the insurance proceeds. Rather than the school, who only had 2 more years, why should they benefit to the tune of a couple $1 million when they were going to have to walk away from the building anyway? So that's some discussion that would occur at the time.
Very good, very good. So we talked about that, and some of those things could lead to a default. And so what constitutes a default, and what are the remedies related to a default? And maybe you might want to say what a default is.
A default means that one party or the other has not adhered to the terms of the ground lease. And there could be a landlord default, or there could be a tenant default. Rarely does the landlord default, because all they have to do really is give you possession of the property, and then everything else is your responsibility as the tenant. However, arguably, the landlord could not give you possession. They could block you from getting to the property, to the leased property. So that's one method of a landlord default. Another one could be they fail to pay an obligation that has priority over the ground lease. In this case, there are none, but let's say a developer comes along and they build something here, and now the property's being taxed, and they don't pay the property taxes. Property taxes will supersede everything, even if you have a memorandum of ground lease. Property tax is number one priority. The only thing that trumps that would be the EPA has a super fund. They have to clean up the site. They have a lien on the property. That trumps everything. But I'm hoping there's no environmental contamination here, and you guys are going to do
We're going to do a phase one.
All right, to determine about environmental issues, if any, here. But if a developer comes along and doesn't pay the property taxes, the developer's in default, but we've built in that you have the right to cure that default. So you could pay the property taxes to avoid a tax sale, and then you can recover from the developer. And you can do that by withholding rent, although the rent may not be enough for a period of time, but you can sue them to recover. So there are ways that a landlord could be in default. They may not maintain. We have a provision in here that they have to maintain the surrounding property and keep it in a sightly condition so it doesn't go to waste and the school looks bad because it's sitting on an ugly piece of property. So there are a few things. And again, you have the right to cure that. You could go clean the place up and then bill them for the cost of doing it. The tenant, of course, has many more ways of defaulting under the ground lease than the landlord does. Right off, they could fail to construct the building. So then what? They could fail to pay rent. They could fail to maintain the exterior of the building. They could violate the use provision. They might turn it into a head shop or an adult bookstore, and that wouldn't go over well with the church. So if you violate the use provision, that's a default. In both cases, landlord default or tenant default, we have a notice and cure provision so that you don't immediately go into default upon the happening of one of these events. But let's say the tenant went into default by violating the use provision. The landlord would give the tenant notice, say, you're in default under lease for these reasons, fix it. And you have a period of time to do that before they can exercise their remedies. The remedies available to the tenant for a landlord default are pretty much curing the landlord's default. If they're blocking the entrance, go unblock it. If they didn't pay the taxes, pay the taxes. If the tenant defaults after notice and cure period, then the landlord can exercise one of many remedies. They can evict you, which would be bad for your lender.
Yeah. Be bad for all of us.
They could terminate the lease. They could, did I say they could cure your default? So if you fail to maintain, they could maintain.
That's curing the default to the lender. If you haven't made payments on the loan, they have the ability to go cure that. And
right. I think I mentioned the financing provision is probably the second most complicated provision of the lease. There are very lender-friendly provisions in the lease that allow the lender to get notice before the landlord can exercise any rights, so that the lender can step in, because if they lose the lease, they don't have anything as collateral. So they want to be able to cure the tenant's default, their borrower's default under the ground lease, so that the lease doesn't go away, because their collateral is the lease and the building.
Okay, very good. Okay, what happens if the church wishes to sell the land? What's the ground lease speak to?
Well, you've heard me mention very briefly a right of first offer. It's a complex right of first offer, which means if the church decides they want to sell the land, they have to offer it to the school first. And there's a period of time for negotiation on the terms and the purchase price for the land. So same thing goes the other way. If you want to sell your interest in the ground lease and the building, you have to offer it first to the church, and there's a negotiation period there as well. Now, we have this right of first offer. That's what it means. It goes to the other party first before you can offer it to anybody else. So if the church wants to take advantage of a great market, and 25 years from now, this area may be really booming and a lot of retail and so forth, so a developer would pay top dollar for it. And they say, now's the time, we want to get out and move to a nicer location. They have to go to the school first and say, let's negotiate a purchase price, and you can't get to an agreement on the purchase price because the church thinks they can get this much and you only want to pay this much. So now that the right of first offer didn't come together, they have the right to go out and solicit offers. And if they get an offer, a legitimate offer from somebody else, they have to go back to you and say, here's what we got, we're ready to sell it for this price, will you match it? So that's now a right of first refusal. You can refuse to match the other offer, or you can agree to accept that price. You might rethink it and say, you know what, we'll go ahead and buy it for that price. And the church is obligated to sell it to the school.
Right. So that's when you hear ROFO, that's right of first offer, and ROFR is right of first refusal. And so depending on which side you're sitting on, it's beneficial to either have a ROFO or a ROFR. So, okay. And if anybody wants more detail around ROFO and ROFR.
ROFR is more beneficial if you're the one who has to decide whether you want to buy it, because at least you'll know the highest dollar you have to pay by being able to match somebody else's offer. That's why we started with a ROFO, so you get the first shot, and then converts to a ROFR, so you have the benefit of both.
Okay. So, yes, that double benefit. So, does either party have the unilateral right to terminate the lease?
Only under one circumstance, and that is if you don't get your approvals to construct the building. Once you have the approvals, everybody's locked in for the term of the lease. Nobody has any unilateral right to say, you know what, we don't like being here, or we don't want you here, so we're terminating. That doesn't exist in the ground lease, because everybody's counting on a long-term situation.
Okay, and finally, what happens to the building at the end of the lease term?
We've talked about reversionary rights, and this is just the nature of a ground lease. You leave, and you give up the building. Ownership reverts to the landlord. So what we find is most tenants stop maintaining the building in the last few years. They don't put any improvements into it. It goes to waste. But keep in mind that, and as Rex said, most likely none of us are going to be around in 40 or 70 years, but there is an obligation to maintain the building. So the landlord could argue that you have to maintain it and it's in a decent condition, so that their expectation is met that they get a decent building when the ground lease terminates. But you have to evacuate the building and surrender possession. The ground lease goes away. There will not be, I guarantee you, there will not be a loan on the property at that point, because no lender is going to make a loan where they might lose it if the ground lease expires. So you probably won't be able to get a loan in the last, 10 or 20 years of the ground lease term.
And hopefully we won't have a loan on it. But No, that's it's good. But there's the other option that I have seen in part of what I do on a regular basis is that you can always renegotiate as those terms are coming to an end to further extend or to set up a new lease, or there's multiple options. The finality is to turn the keys over and walk away, but there are always other options. And since you have most of the use built in, and that's the way the building's built, it would make sense to, instead of going to find another person to lease exactly what you built, to have you lease it. So that is an option as well.
To tell you, practically speaking, how it will work out is somewhere in the last 10 years of the lease term, one party or the other, depending on who the market benefits at the time, is going to go to the other party and say, I'm willing to extend this lease term if, or I'm going to terminate this lease. I mean, I'm not going to renew unless, so that if the market is really, really good and the church thinks it can sell the property and make a ton of money, they're not going to want to renew the lease. However, if the market's really, really bad and they would love to have you here continuing to pay rent, you're going to go to the church and say, you know what, we'd really like to renew for another 20 years, and this market is horrible, so we think we need to pay rent at this level. We've been paying it at this level, we're going to pay it. That's just the way it's going to work, is whoever the market benefits is going to approach the other party as the lease term is coming upon us and try and negotiate to their benefit. And you've seen that with hospitals all the time. When the market was really bad, they were beating up landlords and negotiating low rent increases, lower rents, anything they could get away with. Now it's a different story.
They're still beating us up, but that's another story. So, but that's okay. So that is Ground Lease 101. We're going to open it up for questions. And since you've sat through all of this, there'll be, for those of you who need CE credits, we've signed those, and you just pick them up as you go out the back. But,
for those who need alcohol.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with a question.
Yes, sir.
I want to make sure it's clear. So if Arborbrook signs this ground lease with Central Baptist Church, and in, say, 10 years, Central Baptist Church gets an offer from another developer, we talked about this possibility, that they would, we get the first right of offer or refusal. If we say no, does the new tenant who is purchasing this property have to honor the ground lease?
Absolutely.
Yes. Keep in mind you have a memorandum of ground lease on record, and that can't be messed with. Your lease will remain in place regardless of who buys the land, so that you will always have the right to occupy the leased premises and make use of the common facilities pursuant to the terms of the ground lease and the common area maintenance agreement.
And we also have the ability at our option to do the extensions even if someone else buys it. So we can still be here for 70 years at our option. It's not just the 40.
Okay. Good answer. Good answer.
Good answer. Good answer.
What's the relationship with the existing buildings, and how does that intertwine with the ground lease? Where are those eventually going away?
Good, great question. So did everyone hear the question? Okay, so we currently have multiple years left on our current lease for the overall facility. And part of what we have talked about with the church and what makes sense is that lease is extended as well. And so the way the main lease works, and happy to share, and I think most people don't realize, our lease payments barely cover the electricity bill for the church. This is seen as a mission for them. So we have gotten a great deal, which has allowed us to build up some capital, but we don't pay a lot, just being blunt, and that's okay. It's worked out well for us. But part of the ground lease deal is that we would also negotiate that extension of the rest of the property, and for the most part, we pay a fee, but then we pay per student as well. So as we add students, the more students we have, the more money the church gets. So by building this, it will allow us to have more students as well, and the church would benefit from that. But part of the negotiation for the, and many of you weren't here, but some were, at one point in time, our high school was at Southern Evangelical. And we, at that time, went to this is when I first started dealing with the church. And so went to them and said, I don't like the way this is working. This is not the body working together, which is why that approach has changed. And I think a big reason why our relationship with the church has developed the way it should. And so we went to them and said, it doesn't make sense. We did the wrong thing when we left, and we want to do the right thing. We want to come back, and we think that by investing in you and investing in the property, we're paying a certain amount at Southern Evangelical. If we were to build the gym out and the classrooms in the back, we would get a break on high school students. You know how I said each student pays a per diem? So right now we don't pay for high school students. And that was part of the deal to invest.
Because we
put a lot of money into the gym. And then it started out and we had many cost overruns. But we put a lot of money into the gym. And so as we went through that, part of that is how we coordinate the current lease and the new space, and that just all will work together. And so we will have use of everything as we go forward. We can't build that and another school use the other spaces. But I think the thought is that the classes themselves would be housed eventually in the two buildings, and then the other would be ancillary breakout spaces and that type of stuff. And my vision when we built out the gym was that we would have that, and we'd be able to have showers and other stuff there. So as we go through and we build the student body, which this will allow us to do, we'll have more income where we can invest in the total infrastructure as well and put showers in the gym and continue to just work in the way the body should by encouraging each other.
What percentage of the land will our land lease?
There's over 13 acres here. Our actual ground lease will be less than an acre if you count both buildings.
And it sounds like we could potentially lose use of the common area if the church were to sell and the new owner would basically build on most of it.
That's why we would record a memorandum of lease, and the common area maintenance agreement would prohibit that. So we would always, the way the ground lease works, and we've done this with hospital ground leases, is you're guaranteed a certain amount of common area stuff. And that's also why you would match the current lease up with the ground lease so that you continue to have use over. So yeah, we're thinking about all that. And yeah, so does that help? Does that answer your question?
So parallel to that question, the actual goal would be we would not be using 5 buildings on this campus, but really we would have 2. We'd be using the gym. We'd continue to use that. And this building that we're talking about, in 2 parts, it would eventually, we hope, would become 1 building, just built right next to each other with a connecting hallway. So we wouldn't necessarily need to be in this building anymore, or in the cottage building next door, and the junior high would probably.
Yeah. And so the gym becomes breakout really gym space. The junior high goes away. That's where building 2 is. The quad goes away. So really all you end up with is this building and the cottage. And so those become used for admin or whatever. And then this building becomes the sanctuary, and it should be vacant. I long for the day that classrooms aren't down in the basement and classrooms aren't up above and they're in a nice new Charlotte Mason looking building.
Here, here.
Tutor.
All right. Question. I have a microphone cord that goes very far.
Uh-oh, I know I'm in trouble now.
I have a legal question. I'm just kidding you. My thought is, you guys are very thorough. Thank you for thinking of all these things. But worst case scenario, what if a church comes in? I mean, it's a good case for the church, but let's say in 10 years they're revitalized and all of a sudden the Holy Spirit moves and this church explodes and all of a sudden the facilities, common area facilities, are overridden with people, whereas now they're pretty, vacant, I guess you'd say. Is there some device in the agreement which would adjust it to allow for more growth of the church and higher impact on the facilities like parking?
Okay, so great question, Jeff. So the way that I see that is the current lease outlines what use and when. So like the gym, when we did the gym, unlike every other building on this campus, we get it during the school day, Monday through Thursday, and then if we want to use it like tonight, we have to seek permission. Well, the gym is exactly the opposite. So it's our use, and if the church wants to use it, then they seek permission. And so I see that as, for the most part, there's no overlap because they're using it on Wednesday night and Sunday, and we use it Monday through Thursday, and then the gym, so there really shouldn't be a lot of overlap. But if there is, then if they wanted to use our buildings or the gym, then they come to us, and if we want to use theirs, and frankly, we shouldn't be using theirs much unless we have gatherings like this.
We pray that what you said happened.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. It would. But
it's really the perfect relationship, school and church, because they do complement each other.
It is, and that's why there's a lot of churches that have schools, because they complement. But one of the things that I like about our situation, that many times in those church-school relationships, one drives the other and really becomes the dominant part. And with this relationship, that's not the case. They stand on their own. And so that's really important, and why I love our situation so much better than the standard. And whether it be Carmel or whoever, bless them and glad they have the success they have. But I would not want to be a part of that because one of those drives the other, and I like the separation.
So it sounds like long term you want to move everything kind of into those two buildings. Does the property lay out such that you could bifurcate it eventually, maybe chop off 3 or 4 or 5? Oh, you have to have 10 acres for the school, though.
Yeah. We need that. We need to have that. And frankly, yeah. I mean, if it's a school, it has to be basically you could only chop off 3 acres. And frankly, what I foresee or hope is that as we grow and we grow our endowment or we grow our giving and stuff, that we could actually expand and take on land down that side and take out houses or whatever that may come up for sale or whatever. That would be my hope, is that we continue to have a long-term vision, and that's really the board's responsibility. The board has 2 responsibilities: one, to be an advisor to Andy, and then we actually are his boss, but we're an advisor to him for the most part. And then the other is facilities. And so if the board does their job well, then we will grow. And this is not the first thing we looked at. And Julie's been around long enough. I've been saying since day one that this is our best option because of where we are financially. And we've looked at other options, and we've been close on a couple options, but it just doesn't work. And we have to have something to grow that can put us in at a low basis. And that's what this does. And so to me, it's pretty simple when you just do the math, that given our situation, this is a no-brainer. Yes, Ms. Reynolds.
I have a fundraising question.
A fundraising question. That is the board, advisor, and facilities.
Well, Arborbrook is kind of a closed culture when it comes to
Yes.
fundraising, so I'm just curious what the plan is for that, and if y'all are going to do a capital campaign or try to create a culture of philanthropy versus fundraising, or so I'm just curious, is that something you'll let us know about, what your intention is if you consult with?
Yes. So what we're looking at is seeking outside guidance related to that, and so Andy's doing some, and I don't want to overstep, but Andy's doing some assessments right now of different folks who do that for a living, and so we're looking at that and trying to figure out what our next step is. He's supposed to come back to the board with some suggestions, and then from that we're going to look at next steps. But we will create a capital campaign to try to raise some of the money so that we do not have as much leverage or debt on the property. But that will happen. It's just not quite there yet.
And very astutely talking about getting outside of this closed community, that's got to be a priority. Got to get beyond Arborbrook and into Union County to be able to.
I see Mr. Wise with his hand up.
So I've got, I guess, kind of three questions that can all kind of wrap together. One is how much are we looking at for the building? Two, are we going to have to, or what's our timetable we're looking at? And three, are we going to have to pay to expand the road as well?
Okay, I'll answer those one at a time. We have a preliminary estimate for a building. It would be approximately $125 to $130 a foot for the building, and so that's when you look at that, it's mainly a stick-built building, so it's not stick anymore. It'd be metal stick, not wood stick, but that is somewhere close to what I would expect, and on the because of not as much plumbing, it's going to lower that cost a little bit as opposed to what I'm typically used to, because in my typical experience I've got a sink in every exam room, so that plumbing adds a lot to expenses. But 125 to 130, that was my estimate going in. We talked to the contractor, and he said, yeah, that's probably right in line. It's going to be somewhere in that vicinity. So that's a guess. We haven't priced it out yet. We haven't built it. So all of that's coming. What we have is we've engaged. We haven't signed the contract yet, but we've gone through multiple interviews, and we're working with Myers and Chapman, a large firm, and so they are at a cost plus. So they get that's the way we wanted to set it up. And frankly, I will not do something again with the way we did the gym. We tried to cheap out, and it bit us, and I'm not going down that path again. Just not going to do it. That's not in the best interest of the school, and it just happened. And so that's neither here nor there. Now, okay, hold on. Timetable. Okay, timetable. It probably take 9 months to 12 months to get through the whole process. And once we've engaged, and the ground lease isn't signed yet, so we've got another meeting, and I think we're going to be pretty close after that next meeting to having something that's executable. And so, but right now we're doing some preliminary stuff, putting in a little bit of front end work at an expense to make sure that everything's lining up. So 9 to 12 months. So if you have a current junior, and that's all you got, which is what I have, then they may or may not see light of day in the new building. But the hope was that we could get close to getting in there by the start of next year. But I don't know. If everything works out well, it may be spring break of next year by the time it's finished. And then the expansion of the road, we don't know. We have to go to council, so that'll be a piece that is yet to be determined.
I have a few questions as well.
Only 3 per family.
Oh, shoot. Are there going to be any women on the design team?
Wow. You went there. That's your first question.
Yes, my
Joy.
joy.
Now, so the hope was that we're going to look at it, but I can't, and we don't have anybody on the board that is a project manager. And so actually my first thought was to look at a couple people that I know have some project management experience. And so we're going to look at that, but my first 2 thoughts were actually women. And so that's on the project management side. The board is also involved, and Yolanda is very experienced at this as well. And so she's going to play a big role, and I can see some sort of task force. But frankly, we're going to have an architect that does work for schools, and so I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but I do want somebody with input that's just as you can see. We have Bryan because sometimes, as a hospital CEO once told me, he said, please just save me from myself. Sometimes we need saved from ourselves. And so input is fine, but I want some experts involved that know what they're doing and how a school should be laid out and how the classroom should be laid out. So my hope is that we will have plenty of female interaction through the process.
And then as far as the ideas of the building's appearance, you mentioned Stacia's idea of Charlotte Mason. My thoughts on that are you have this older building and then you have the gym. So I guess my thoughts are you're planning on something that kind of bridges the gap between, you've got different styles.
I'm hoping not. I'm hoping it looks, I'm hoping that at least my thought is, and it's not just me driving this, so the whole board will be involved, and then part of it is we will want feedback from the community as well. So when I say these are just my thoughts and not the thought of the board, and if you know the board, we have folks who are happy to speak up, so it's not just going to be me driving this. But my thought would be that those 2 buildings eventually block out the gym, and because they should, and then from the road you would view the church, this building, and then those 2 buildings, and then you would see the church office, and who knows how long that stays there or what happens. But it would be buildings that, and frankly, it's going to have to look pretty good to get approval from the town of Wesley Chapel. So TBD, but I feel like we'll have something that everyone should be proud of.
Myers and Chapman asked in some of the initial meetings just what kind of building you're looking for. You're looking for an institutional school, and I immediately said, no, we're not looking for an institutional school. We're looking for something different. And they mentioned that they had built Woodlawn. Have you ever seen Woodlawns? You might want to just Google their school. It is, it's kind of looking like from the outside, it looks like a big, beautiful barn house. It does not look like you're going into a school, and would be much more of a warm feel, welcoming feel than an institution.
What's the premium to do that?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be some money involved, but we feel like there has to be a balance here in all things. We're not going to go through to have the premium, but we got to spend some money to actually get what is our.
Yeah, but Jeff, but if you think about that, I mean, when you're looking at a stick-built building, you've got the interior, but the skin is not that expensive. I mean, it's minimal, and you're probably talking going from blah to something that is more like what we want for maybe $5 a foot, $7 a foot, something like that on 10,000 feet. So you're talking minimal overall expense to get.
One more question. Just, well, it's an idea really, but just an encouragement to contact the alumni families for fundraising, because they have an attachment to the school. They prayed for the school. They've had kids benefit from the school. And so, I mean, just don't forget the alumni families.
Absolutely. And and proud to say that my daughter has already started to give back too. So
That's right.
So that's good.
I just have two quick ones. What will the ultimate size of the school be? What are the numbers that this new building will hold?
Okay, so each building is slated to hold about 200 students. So the total at the school, where we've been all along and pretty united as a board and where we want to be, we think 400 students is pretty much where we want to be. And right now we're at it's changed a little bit over the last few days, but we're at 215. So a little more than double the size. And it amounts to really 2 full classrooms per grade.
Okay. And then next year, as they're doing the building, where will the current high schoolers, the classes that meet in the quad?
Great question. Yeah, it's going to be study hall, home study hall. No.
Great.
No. So great question. Part of the process with Myers and Chapman is to move the quad to a different location so we don't lose any classroom space during the construction. And then after it's finished, the quad goes away.
Okay.
May have the fire department here for a burning party or something. I don't know.
The kids would probably like that.
Okay. Back down front? Okay.
I'm sure you've done some economics and yes, there's baseline students necessary to support the type of financing that you're looking at. What was that?
There is, and so it's dependent on which students and where, because different grade levels pay different amounts. But it's approximately the range to get to close to where we want to be is 20 to 25 additional students. And so we feel pretty confident based on the path that we've had over the last few years and the growth that we've had. We've continued to tick up over the last few years, but we also feel like 2 things, and just being blunt, because I kind of tell you what I believe. But one, we think by having the new building that we'll clearly have additional desire to come to the school, and by having updated facilities. But frankly, if we do nothing, I don't think the high school survives. And so that's just being blunt. I don't think we can survive given our current setup for the long term. And so part of this is to continue to build momentum and not.
That's such a nice thing to have, K-12. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so our family's been blessed to have 2 make it all the way through, and 1 that's a year and a few months away from making it through the last one. But to have, Grace started the first year when she was in 4th grade, but to be able to have that continuation and to get the even more, and this is no secret, it's more Charlotte Mason the earlier years, and as you go up, it tends to not be as much Charlotte Mason, and that's just the reality. And if you didn't know that, I'm sorry. But there's still that overall feel, but it's just not it just doesn't work the same as you go forward. And so it is nice to have that continuum. Anyone else? Did I shock anyone by telling them that it wasn't? The board has in our documents, by what we're governed by, we set the tuition rate each year. We have a minimum amount that we can go up and a maximum. And so the 20 to 25 students is basically continuing at a cost of living increase every year. So it's not a tuition increase, and I will oppose anything that raises tuition, because we have so many families, and this is really touches me deep. We have so many families that sacrifice so much to send their kids here, and they're right on the level. They don't take vacations, they don't do a lot of things, but they sacrifice to send their kids here. And if we had to raise tuition to make this happen, to me, that's a non-starter. And so raise tuition more than a cost of living. Now, we're going to have to continue to go up a couple % every year, and that's just part of keeping up with everything else. And frankly, most of what we've done in raising tuition over the last, since I've been on the board, I don't know, I guess I've been on 8 years or so, but most of that has gone to increasing teacher salaries. And we were considerably low on teacher salaries. We're still not the highest teacher salary by any stretch of the imagination. Our teachers here, I think I can say this fairly, consider this part of their mission. And so we're never going to be that high-paying teacher piece, but we're also a little different than everyone else. So does that answer your question? Or did I say too much?
So I ask you a question, Bryan. I know this is a term that's hard to cover every conceivable possibility in the future, obviously, but what someone was saying earlier about this property becoming more valuable over time, I can see that happening. It could be a retail location, let's see around here. So 10 years down the road, if that were to happen, a school for whatever reason were to start declining and have issues, and all of a sudden the developer comes in and makes it all the church, school can't respond quickly enough to move together the funds to exercise those right things for all of it. Would it be possible now in advance to put some kind of provision in the lease whereby if that happens in a shopping center or investor who wants to develop an addition to the shopping center, whatever, buys the property, that since it's not a church anymore, you could adjust the use provisions on the building you're building so that you would have more liberal ability to sublease that building since it's not a church anymore?
Well, Rex and I talked about not bringing this up tonight, but the ground lease does not include what we call a going dark provision, which means neither party is obligated to stay in business. So if the church decides it doesn't want to be a church anymore, they're going to sell out, does that give you any remedies? Does that give the school the right to say, well, then we can terminate the lease, or then we can change our use of this premises? And you're bringing up that question now. We were going to discuss that outside of the scope, but yes, it's an important provision. You generally have a co-tenancy clause or a going dark provision when there's a symbiotic relationship. If your existence is dependent on them and theirs is dependent on you, for example, you go to a shopping center anchored by Harris Teeter, none of those other stores would be there if Harris Teeter wasn't there, right? So if Harris Teeter goes away, the tenants want the right to go away themselves. So you could have that same type of provision here, that if the church no longer operates as a church, or they sell the property to somebody else who's going to use it for some other purpose, what are your rights? Same thing with the school. The church may want to say the same thing, that if you stop operating as a school, then we're going to stop operating as a church and we can do X, Y, and Z. That's a provision we didn't intend to discuss tonight, but it's a good point that needs to be contemplated for the ground lease.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to close us and just say to all of you and all of you who will be listening to this presentation, if you have questions, comments, feedback, the
Give 'em
board
to
wants to
Andy.
hear. Yeah, you can send them to me, but I'm passing them to the board since it's their job to figure all this out. But if you do have other thoughts and you want, feel free to write them to me and I'll pass them along.
And my email's also available through the website as well.
So rex.noble@arborbrook.org.
I do check it every so often.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, with that, thank you all very much for coming. Let me just say a word of prayer, and we'll close for the evening. Father, thanks. Thank you for these men who have prepared well tonight to speak with us. Father, we trust you and your guidance for our school, and just ask for continued wisdom and blessing as we move forward. Lord, in the direction that we should go, we just ask for unity of mind and heart. We also ask for your provision and your wisdom to get us there, Lord. And we call on you as, Lord, our guide and our provider, and we are thankful that you are present. And we love you. We give you praise and thanks for Arborbrook, and ask just for your continued moving us forward. In Jesus' name, amen.